Greetings, U.S. history students. This video is about the British American colonies, the 13 British colonies that will someday become the beginning of the United States of America. And in the video, we're going to look at the colonies, not necessarily individually, but by region. You see, there were three particular regions that the colonies were grouped into in early colonial America. There was New England in the north, there was the Chesapeake Southern region in the south, and then there was the middle colonies in the middle of the 13 colonies. They were broken down by region, not just because of geography, but because of cultural, economic, political, religious practices that took place amongst all the colonies in that region. They shared traits and characteristics. As you're following along, I encourage you to take out your I can statement list and to take notes on various aspects of the colonial regions, because one of your I can questions and a very big question on your unit exam is going to be asking you to compare the different colonial regions and identify ways that they are similar and different from each other and why they're similar and different. So you'll be able to get a lot of good information about that in this video and also in the activities that you'll be doing for the rest of this lesson. So the first region we're going to look at is the southern colonies. Southern colonies consist of Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. Of these colonies, Virginia is the oldest. So it's the first colony established by England in 1607, and Georgia would be the youngest of these colonies that emerged in the early 1730s. The colonies of the southern colonies was pretty much based around agriculture and the production of what we call cash crops. Cash crops are crops that are grown that are worth a lot of money. And typically these crops would be grown in the Americas, grown in these English colonies in North America, and then they'd be sold across to Europe and to places in Asia as well to make Britain a lot of money, hence the cash crop. The most lucrative of these early cash crops, believe it or not, was tobacco. We often think about the South and cotton being this really important cash crop, but the first major cash crop was tobacco, and that was what made Virginia such a lucrative colony during its early years. Eventually, in the 1800s, cotton will become a very productive and valuable cash crop as well after the invention of the cotton gin, but not quite yet, not during this unit. Rice will be a lucrative cash crop, as will sugar. Both were grown in South Carolina. Rice in particular was grown in South Carolina, and so is indigo and hemp. So it's agriculture down here, and that makes sense that agriculture would be the predominant economic activity because in the southern part of the colonies, you have long growing seasons. You typically have really fertile soil, and you just have like the right geographic features for growing crops and for having plantations to mass produce the crops. Because it was a cash crop based society and most people worked on farms or on plantations, there was a large demand for coerced labor or labor to come over and work on these plantations. So many of the people that settled in these southern colonies are going to be indentured servants or enslaved laborers. Indentured servants were the first major group to arrive. An indentured servant was somebody who made an agreement. They signed a contract to a plantation owner in the American colonies, and by signing this contract, they promised to give 5 to 7 years of work to this plantation owner in exchange for them to pay for their passage to the North American colonies. So if you were a Virginia plantation owner and you wanted someone to work on your tobacco plantation, you would put out a bunch of contracts for indentured servants, and you promised them, a place to work for 5 to 7 years and to pay for their trip across the Atlantic as long as they worked for you for those 5 to 7 years. This was a great deal for many people in England because a lot of them were too poor to afford to take the passage, the ship across the Atlantic to come to the colonies. So this was a good compromise for them. And then after 5 to 7 years, they'd be free. We also see enslaved Africans being brought over to the southern colonies to work on these plantations. Initially, there were very few enslaved Africans brought over, and slavery was relatively low in the southern colonies. Slavery will exist in all the colonies and existed most often in the southern colonies, but it wasn't until like 1676, which is about 70 years after the first colony, that's a long time, that slavery really started to grow and become a major source of the population. By 1775 and 1776, the beginning of the American Revolutionary War, so about 150 plus years after the first colony, some of these southern colonies will have very large slave populations. About two-thirds of the population of South Carolina will be enslaved blacks, and there'll be about a 40% percentage of the population in Virginia that will be enslaved blacks as well. So you have this large labor force. It's worth pointing out that most of these laborers that came over as either indentured servants or as enslaved Africans and slave workers were men, typically young men, and there were very few women. If you did not own a plantation and you were not producing a cash crop and you lived in the southern colony, you were probably a subsistence farmer, meaning you owned some land, a tiny bit of land for yourself, and you made a living by just growing crops that you could feed yourself and sell any extras to other individuals within the region. So you basically just sort of took care of yourself. We often called them yeoman farmers, individuals who owned their land and basically just survived living off their land. Now, the social system in the southern colonies was quite fragile. That's because you have this unusual balance of men and women. Most people in the southern colonies were men. That's because when they were first establishing these colonies, like in Virginia and in Maryland, um, they're going to ask for indentured servants to come over, and most indentured servants were young men as opposed to women. You don't have family units migrating over all at once to settle these regions. And so you get this huge imbalance between men and women. Initially, you had about three-fourths of the people living in the colony of Virginia being men and only a quarter being women. That's a pretty poor ratio there for trying to create a population that can sustain itself by having families and kids. As time goes by, that'll get less aggressive. By the beginning of the Revolutionary War, it'll be about two-thirds men and one-third women, but you still have this really tricky imbalance. It's also worth pointing out that a lot of the early colonies in the South were built along rivers that contained lots of mosquitoes, and these mosquitoes would have diseases like malaria, and this would cause a huge increase in illness. So there's lots of disease in the southern colonies that would wipe out some of the settlements because they were unprepared to deal with, the swampy conditions that they chose to settle in and the diseases that came with it. What made it possible for these colonies to survive was there was just so much demand in England for jobs and for new opportunities and for a way out of the English way of life that there was just a constant steady flow of indentured servants. Even though they're mostly men, or there was a constant flow of enslaved laborers, this constant flow of immigrants coming over and over allowed the colonies to survive. It didn't lead to any large, population booms, and there were very few major cities that emerged, but it did make it possible for the colonies to survive despite the high amounts of disease and the imbalance of men and women. It was a fairly structured social hierarchy in the southern colonies. Wealthy individuals came over. They typically acquired land through the headright system and acquired indentured servants to work that land for them. And the wealthy stayed wealthy and kept acquiring land. If you came over as a poor indentured servant and you settled in the southern colonies, the odds were that you were not going to acquire enough wealth to reach a new social level. There really wasn't much of a middle class. You either were wealthy or you weren't wealthy, or you were an indentured servant or an enslaved laborer. So it was a very stratified social hierarchy, not a lot of chance for mobility there. Predominantly, people living in this area practiced the Anglican Church. The Anglican Church is the Church of England. It was the religion that was created by Henry VIII during the Protestant Reformation. Henry VIII is the guy that wanted to get a divorce so he could have a son or a male heir, and the Pope said no. So he broke away from the Catholic Church during the Protestant Reformation to create his own church, the Church of England. There was many similarities between the Church of England and the Catholic faith, but there were a couple differences. One being that the King of England was in charge of the Anglican Church and he could get a divorce if he wanted to. Most folks in the southern colonies were very loyal to England, and they were also part of this Anglican Church. Politically, there was some moments of instability in the southern colonies. Because you have this really stratified social hierarchy of the wealthy with all this power and influence and the poor with very little influence, you had a lot of political tension. And this can be seen with this event called Bacon's Rebellion, where a large number of poor farmers and indentured servants rose up against the plantation elite, the leaders of the Virginia colony in Jamestown, and actually overthrew those leaders temporarily and burnt the capital, Jamestown, to the ground. Eventually, this revolution was put down by British troops, which came in as reinforcements and ended the rebellion. But it sort of shows this political tension between the rural, lower class individuals in the Virginia colony and the wealthy elites of the plantations in that colony. And you can kind of find that in other southern colonies as well. There's also lots of tensions with Native Americans that made things difficult. Initially, when Jamestown was first founded, Native Americans helped this colony survive, and they helped them get through the first several winters of bad harvests and terrible weather conditions to survive those initial years. But as the colony began to grow, the Virginia settlers from Jamestown spread into Native American land and territory, and this led to lots of conflict and fighting. Also, Europeans brought with them, accidentally, diseases like smallpox, which spread and wiped out a lot of the different Native American tribes around the southern colonies, tribes like the Powhatan Confederation. As a result, you get a lot of warfare, a lot of conflict, which also led to political instability in the area. All right, so that was the southern Chesapeake region. We're now going to look north to the New England region. If you ever wonder why the New England Patriots, the football team, are called New England, it's because these states up here, Massachusetts, namely, but also New Hampshire, Rhode Island, and Connecticut, are often referred to as New England as a region. So that football team represents that entire region of sports fans. So those are the colonies that were settled there. Most people came to New England because they were searching for a chance to practice their faith, their religion, without discrimination. So you're going to get a wide variety of people that come and arrive in New England, and they're coming as family units, and they're typically coming because they want to practice their faith. So in the southern colonies, people migrated to the southern colonies because they wanted a chance for land. They're coming for money. They're coming for opportunities for jobs. People typically came to New England for religious reasons, which made religion very important in that area. There will be lots of economic diversity in New England. This area here of the Atlantic seaboard of North America has got really rocky soil. It's got a really short growing season. It's got really cold winters. It's not great for growing cash crops. So if you wanted to try and grow tobacco in Massachusetts at this time, you're not going to have a lot of luck, and you probably wouldn't make very much money. So they had to find other ways of making a living besides just growing large plantations of tobacco, cotton, rice, and so on. And this is because of the weather. So they usually did small scale farming, subsistence farming, or they got involved in fishing. There's a huge industry in catching cod, a very delicious, large type of fish in this area here of the Atlantic seaboard. And so maritime fishing was a big thing, and so was trade. A major economic activity in New England was harvesting wood and making ships and making different products that could be used for trade across the Atlantic. So there's a diverse economy in New England. You weren't just a farmer like you would be in the South. You might be a farmer here, you might be a fisherman or fisherwoman, or you might be involved in some type of shipbuilding, maritime trade activity. And that created more diversity for the kind of jobs you could have. It also made for a more healthy economy. If you had a bad harvest one year, it didn't ruin the entire economy of the region like it would in the South. There was many different things that existed for people to do. Because there was a variety of jobs, there was far more social mobility in New England. You would have the opportunity, if you arrived here as like a poor individual or a poor laborer, you'd have the opportunity to work your way up and become middle class or maybe even upper class based on your economic activity. So where in the South, if you were poor to begin with, you probably stayed poor. If you were rich, you probably stayed rich. There was opportunities for social mobility in New England, which is something that people typically pride themselves in the United States today, that you can make something of yourself and rise up or fall down economically or socially based on your activities. When people migrated to New England, they typically came in large family units. So, unlike in the southern colonies where people migrated to work on farms and plantations, people migrated to New England to practice their faith, and they brought their entire family with them. So, you're going to get a lot of Puritans that arrive. This is a type of Protestant faith that emerges in England. You're going to get separatists, a radical group of Puritans that emerge during this time that migrate over to the area. These people are coming, and they're not just coming as only men. They're bringing the entire family unit, husbands, wives, kids, and so on, and their extended family too. So New England will be very populated, a very high density region of the colonies, and you're going to have a lot of men and women there, a very healthy balance between the two sexes. This will lead to a large population growth and a lot more cities. In the southern colonies, there aren't as many cities because people are coming to farm, and the farms take up a lot of land. So your neighbors aren't very close together. There's very few large cities in the southern colonies because they need all their land for farming. In New England, where farming was less prominent and you had more people living together, they would form these tight, close knit communities that would typically be based on a variety of economic activities. So you have more cities in the north in New England, greater economic diversity, and you had a better balance of men and women, which led to a population that could grow more sustainably. Now, because people migrated to New England for religious reasons, they weren't necessarily very tolerant about different religions. Massachusetts was founded by the Massachusetts Bay Colony, which was a collection of Puritans. And the Puritans believed in predestination, so that, like, before you were even born, God had already determined who was going to go to heaven, who was going to go to hell. They believed in living a very pious lifestyle where people were very devout, they avoided sin, and they worked very hard. Massachusetts was designed to be what was called a city upon a hill. They hoped that other places around the world would see the way that they lived and the moral standard that they held themselves to as Puritans, and that as a result of this, other places would want to copy their religious practices in their community, and it would spread the Puritan faith. If you didn't practice Puritan values and if you weren't part of the Puritan church, you would have been kicked out of Massachusetts. You weren't allowed to live there initially, and you'd have to go live somewhere else. So that's not really tolerant of other religions. They were going there for a place to practice their religion freely, but they didn't really want other religious groups practicing their faith there. This was similar to Plymouth, which was another colony that was settled in Massachusetts, what is now modern day Massachusetts, where they wanted religion to be practiced a certain way and weren't very tolerant of other people. An example of an effect of this lack of tolerance would be Connecticut. There were some Puritans that disagreed with the majority of Puritans living in Massachusetts about what were the best practices for their church and the best way to run their community. They were forced out of Massachusetts and had to find a new place to live, and so they created the Connecticut colony in Hartford. Similarly, there'd be a guy named Roger Williams in Massachusetts who was a Puritan, but he believed in separation of church and state. He didn't think church leaders should also be in charge of the political government policies of a region. And he also thought that you should have a religious tolerance, that if you had a colony here, you should be allowed to practice whatever religion you want to practice, and there shouldn't be laws against that. So he was kicked out of Massachusetts, and he ended up making his own colony in Rhode Island. And so Rhode Island ended up becoming a haven, a safe place for people of a variety of religious beliefs that weren't welcomed in other parts of New England. So religion was this big factor for people moving there. It also caused a lot of tension. We'll have the Salem witch trials as well that take place in New England. And so it brought good things and bad things to people living in that region. Our final region would be the middle colonies. The middle colonies are named because they're the colonies between the southern Chesapeake colonies and the New England colonies. There's a variety of New England colonies. The most notable ones are New York and Pennsylvania, and New Jersey and Delaware were also considered part of the middle colonies. Like New England, they'll be extremely diverse economically. If you lived in New York or New Jersey, it would have been hard to have done to grow cash crops and to have plantations. If you lived in Pennsylvania and Delaware, it would have been easier and more possible to grow cash crops. So you have a variety of economic activities depending on the geography. People in New York did a lot with trade, a lot with banking and finance, which is still something that's very common in New York today. People did a lot with trade and manufacturing in Pennsylvania, but they also grew a lot of wheat. Pennsylvania was known as the breadbasket of America, or the American colonies. And so they had a diverse economy as well. So we see manufacturing, production of grain in Pennsylvania in particular, and a lot of trade with other parts of the Atlantic system. So building ships and bringing goods back and forth. Like New England, there was a lot more social mobility in the middle colonies. You had a chance to rise from lower to middle to upper class. The middle class was quite large for this time period in the middle colonies, especially in Pennsylvania, which was known for being a very diverse and tolerant place. Like New England, you have a bunch of family units. that migrate over, and you're going to get a whole bunch of immigrants that come to the middle colonies. You'll get people from the Netherlands, you'll get people from Scotland, Ireland, England, some people from France that were religious dissidents in France that wanted to practice their religion freely. They came over. And you have a ton of English people as well that come to the middle colonies. And because it was such a diverse place, it naturally embraced diversity. You were not treated differently because of where you were from, because there were so many different ethnic groups and nation states represented in this colony. So there was far more toleration, and there was a lot more religious openness and understanding as a result. The best example of this religious toleration that existed in Pennsylvania would be what William Penn did. Pennsylvania was founded by William Penn. William Penn was a Quaker. This was a new type of religion that emerged, a type of Christianity. And Quakers were nonviolent. They didn't believe in a formal clergy, so no church leadership. And they didn't necessarily believe in like differences between the rights of men and women. They had a lot of beliefs that conflicted with religious groups and people of the time. And so they were often persecuted. William Penn created this colony as a safe haven for Quakers, as well as other people who were persecuted for their religious beliefs. And so it became this very diverse and tolerant place because of these Quaker values that emerged in the area. All right, so just some kind of general patterns to be aware of for these colonies. Religion. There's a variety of religious groups that exist in these colonies. It says New England and Middle up there, but also in the southern colonies. You have Puritans, Separatists, Quakers, Methodists, Baptists, Presbyterians, Anglicans, and Catholics. So there's a lot of different types of Christianity that exist in these colonies during this time period. That is part of the identity of the Americas, this idea that there is some religious freedom here. There is more freedom in some places than others for the colonies. Like you had more religious freedom in Pennsylvania than you did in Massachusetts, but there was still options. Politics. Initially, a lot of churches influenced the politics of each colony, but as time went on, the influence of the local church went away and it had less control over the laws and the governing practices of those colonies. And then there was a lot of diversity in who was coming over. Depending on what region you were in, you have indentured servants, you have people who are enslaved, you have people that are coming over that are of this religious group, you have a variety of nations sending people over. So there's lots of diversity in the colonies compared to other colonies of the time period. Now, the last couple slides kind of hit on how the different colonial regions were different from each other, but they did have a lot of similarities and a lot of unifying experiences. One would be commerce. All the colonies were part of the English colonial empire. They all participated in what's called mercantilism, meaning they had to follow a set of laws that England placed on them for trade. These mercantilist laws were created to make sure that England made a lot of money from their colonies. So some of these mercantilist laws were that like any goods that people wanted to import in the colonies. So if like someone from the colonies wanted to buy a good from France, those goods had to go to England first. England got a cut of the money from those goods, and then they sold those goods to the colonies at a higher price. Another example of a mercantilist law, these are often known as the Navigation Acts, would be that any colonial export, anything that the colonies wanted to sell, they had to get approval to sell these goods from England. So England could tell them who they could sell it to and for how much they could sell it for. These mercantilist laws were very restrictive, and there was a lot of colonists that actually ignored these laws or tried to violate them. And these would be smugglers who would try and break the law to make more money. So all the colonies experienced mercantilism and restrictions on their trade from England because England wanted to make money off of their colonies. Another shared experience would be consumption. All these English colonies imported goods from England, they imported English products, they all bought different manufactured goods from England. So there's a distinct English taste as far as culture in all these colonies. Religion. There's a variety of religions in the different colonies, and so this diversity is a huge part of the colonial experience. And all the colonies went through this thing called the Great Awakening, which was a gigantic religious revival where for about 20 years, people in the colonies became very engaged in religious practices, and there was increased participation in church and religious practices. All the colonies experienced the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment was a philosophical movement that started in Europe that then came to the North American colonies, where people believe they could use reason and educated understanding to create a more just and sound society. They could use logic and reasoning to create better forms of government. So we have just a lot of similarities and differences between the different colonies that you should be aware of. And the big idea of this lecture is you should be able to figure out a couple characteristics of traits, a couple, 2 to 3, for each colonial region. And if you were asked to compare the different colonial regions, New England, Middle, and Southern, you'd be able to find similarities and differences and be able to explain why those existed. For the next part of the activity, you'll be doing some reading from the textbook. And as you read the textbook, you'll get a better understanding of these regions and why they had their similarities and differences. Good luck.